Hi, everyone. In this episode of our Spotlight podcast, I want to turn my attention to a rather local issue, and that is here in Michigan on November 6th of 2018. Among the things we will be voting for is Proposal 1, which, if passed, will legalize recreational marijuana, and Michigan would become one of the next wave of states that has legal recreational marijuana. Michigan has had legal medical marijuana for some time. Now, beyond my personal interest as a resident of Michigan, as president here at ADE, we also have a professional interest in this issue. And so I followed it for a number of years as states have legalized marijuana. And I've looked at some of the various studies that have come out of that. I've talked to people who are a lot smarter than I am about it. And as it became evident that we were going to be voting on it in Michigan, I really turned my attention to what that might mean for Michigan. So I'm going to talk about that. Interestingly enough, I was in Maine a few weeks back, and now Maine has legal recreational marijuana, has had for a couple of years, and it was interesting that they are currently tweaking their laws. Some of the things that they're finding 2 years down the road that need some adjustment, and it was just interesting to see that they're a couple of years ahead of us. Also interesting to those of us in Michigan, and it's true in Maine as well, is that Canada, now today as I record this is October 16th, October 17th, legal marijuana will be legal across the whole country of Canada. And of course we share a border with Canada, as does Maine. So that's just sort of an interesting wrinkle to this. And I think it will be even more interesting if the proposal fails in Michigan, where marijuana will be legal in Canada but still illegal here in Michigan. There's going to be some, I think, significant focus on border issues. But anyway, let's start first with some facts. What is it that we in Michigan here will be voting on? Proposal 1, as it's written on the ballot, I was able to, I obtained an absentee ballot because I will be away from the state of Michigan on voting day. And so I was able to see what was on the ballot. And as I look at Proposal 1, if passed, this is what it would allow. Individuals 21 and older would be able to purchase and use marijuana and marijuana-infused edibles. Also, grow up to 12 marijuana plants for personal consumption. Now, there will be a 10-ounce limit on possession on marijuana kept at residences, and any amount over 2.5 ounces has to be in a locked container. There's some wording in the proposal about creating a state licensing system for marijuana businesses, as well as allowing a 10% tax. And this tax money would be dedicated to implementation costs, clinical trials, schools, roads, municipalities, etc. I'm going to have a little bit more to say about the specifics of the money here in a little bit. Also noteworthy is that Proposal 1, if passed, would change several current violations from a criminal violation to a civil infraction. And it's a simple yes or no question on the ballot. Now, many of the polls that I've seen prior to the election indicate that this will probably pass. We'll have to wait and see. I did an informal poll on my Facebook page and talking to friends and family and colleagues, and the folks I talked to were overwhelmingly in favor of legal recreational marijuana, overwhelmingly in favor of passing Proposal 1 for a variety of reasons, including one person who said to me this morning, live and let live. If people want to smoke marijuana, they should be able to, and that's it. Interesting that in that small sample size, but people were overwhelmingly in favor of it. So, that being said, I did some homework. I looked at a variety of studies online. I looked at newspaper articles, talking to people, all that kind of stuff, and I learned quite a bit that I'd like to share with you, and then hopefully this information will help allow you to make up your mind. One of the reasons that I think this is significant is the permanence of this kind of decision. On the ballot, we're going to be voting for governors and senators and representatives and trustees and commissioners and the like. And we get a chance to do that every so often, every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. We vote for different offices. So if we don't like the person who's in office now, we know we'll get a chance down the road to vote for somebody else and make that change. One of the things that's significant, I think, with Proposal 1, as I say, is the permanence of it. And I'm fond of saying that you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And once marijuana is legal and we get a little bit further down that road, it would be very difficult, I think, to undo that. Of course, it can always be tweaked, but undoing that done. So there is a sense of permanence here that isn't lost on me. So I wanted to make sure that I'm making an informed decision, and I want to make sure that the listeners are making an informed decision. But let's start with the money. I mentioned in the opening that retail sales of marijuana and edibles will be subject to a 10% tax. Now, where is that money going to go? And how much money is that going to be? There was an article that I discovered yesterday on MLive online. Now, MLive is a news source here in Michigan. I found an article online where they indicated that the expected revenues in 2023, assuming that Proposal 1 passes, the expected revenues would be $288 million for the state in 2023. Now, that's a significantly higher estimate than we've seen in the past. And if those numbers hold, it would break down as follows. $140 million of that money would be earmarked for school aid, $63 million for the Michigan Transportation Fund, and the rest would be divided as follows. $27 million to the counties, $27 million to the cities, $3 million to administer the program and to monitor the licensing program, $10 million for revenue sharing, and $17 million would be earmarked for the general fund. Now, that's a lot of money, but a couple things worth noting. One is that nowhere in that did I see any additional spending on law enforcement, which is significant, and I think we're going to touch a little bit on that as part of an unanswered question here in a few minutes. And the other thing is that while that's a lot of money, there's a significant argument to be made that the decision shouldn't be made based on money. And is that enough money to make it worth it? There was a gentleman quoted in the article, a gentleman named Scott Greenlee, who is the leader of the opposition campaign, Healthy and Productive Michigan. And he said that the new estimates change nothing. I'm quoting him here. Quote, "We're talking about a tiny half a drop in the bucket for the state budget," Greenlee said. And I think he speaks for people who feel that this decision shouldn't be made based on the money, even if it is $134 million or $288 million, as the most recent estimates indicate. So I think that's worth noting as well. Now, the other let's talk about some of these other articles that I found, because they really ran the gamut. So I start with an article I found in the Sunday issue of the Detroit Free Press a couple weeks back. And the Detroit Free Press, if I can grab the article here, came out in favor of Proposal 1. The headline of the article I saw was "Smoker or Not, Vote Yes on Legal Weed." And now it went on, the Detroit Free Press went on to outline the arguments that they felt were in favor of Proposal 1. And these are arguments I think we've heard before, but let's list them anyway. First and foremost was that prohibition doesn't work. And the Free Press reports that 15% of the population in the state of Michigan uses marijuana. And I guess the gist is that because prohibition doesn't work, because people are using it anyway, we may as well make it legal and get some of the benefits of that. Enforcing illegal marijuana use consumes law enforcement resources that could be used elsewhere. Related to law enforcement, the argument the Free Press makes is that current enforcement unfairly targets African Americans. It's reported that African Americans and white folks use marijuana at the same rates, but African Americans are 4 to 10% more likely to be arrested. And so that supports the idea that legalizing marijuana not only will allow municipalities to put law enforcement resources elsewhere, but it will eliminate the unfair targeting of African Americans when it comes to marijuana use. The Free Press also goes on to note that the amount of revenue and how healthy that will be for a state that needs it. The article also notes that for 2 years following passage, $20 million will be earmarked for research into the effectiveness of marijuana on combating PTSD and other mental health issues for veterans. So those are the arguments outlined in the Detroit Free Press article that supports Proposal 1. But there's quite a number of voices on the other side as well. I want to just talk a little bit about an article I found in a different newspaper, and that is the Oakland Press. And the Oakland Press had a letter, a guest column, I should say, from a gentleman named Matthew Wilk. And Matthew Wilk is the treasurer of the Northville Public Schools Board of Education. And he wrote a column titled "School Boards Parents Should Oppose Proposal 1." And he raised the following arguments on the anti side of Proposal 1. He speaks of the likelihood that with passage that more marijuana would find its way into schools. There was some mention in his column of edible snacks, marijuana-infused snacks that kids may unwittingly bring to school, that may be passed from child to child, and children may be ingesting marijuana in ways that they're not even aware of. Secondly, he talks about a very significant issue of vaping. If you don't know what vaping is, those are the electronic cigarettes that are oftentimes used for smoking marijuana. And that is a significant issue. I did some looking into vaping as well, and I have a few things I might want to say about that here in a few minutes. But this gentleman, the treasurer for the Northville Public Schools Board of Education, comes out very strongly against this proposal. He indicates that 1 in 6 teens who use marijuana get addicted to it. Marijuana is the number one reason why kids enter treatment for substance abuse. And also that an argument that we've heard on the anti-side is that the marijuana that is being used now is significantly stronger than marijuana that may have been used by generations past. And that's something that we need to be aware of. So there are significant arguments and significant voices on the anti side as well. Let's talk about vaping for just a minute, though. I wanted to know a little bit more about that. And I found in the Journal of JAMA Pediatrics some numbers. 1 in 11 students have used marijuana in electronic cigarettes. That amounts to about 2.1 million in high school kids. And a adolescent that lives with a tobacco user is more likely to use marijuana in an electronic cigarette. And this is, it's a little bit of a Wild West territory. So much so that the FDA recently gave the 5 largest e-cigarette makers 60 days to provide plans to prevent underage use. So it's a real significant concern, and there's not a lot known about the long-term effects of this. And so that is a real concern for the anti-marijuana advocates. Another article that I found that made arguments against Proposal 1 came from a report by an organization called Smart Approaches to Marijuana. And they had a report called, quote, Lessons Learned from Marijuana Legalization in 4 U.S. States and the District of Columbia, unquote. Now, I saw this article. It's a summary of that report. And the writer of the article pulled some bullet points from that report to support her argument against legal marijuana. So I want to qualify some of this by saying I have not seen the entire report. So we may have to take some of this with a little bit of grain of salt. But there were some eye-opening statistics. And so part of the report was asking adolescents about their past month's use of marijuana. And the report indicates that this use continues to rise above the national average for youth aged 12 to 17 in states where marijuana is legal. Now, to be fair, I have seen other reports that don't support that theory, that though there is a fear that adolescent marijuana use will increase in these areas, that hasn't proven to be the case. But what has proven to be the case, and I think this is related or relevant not only to legal marijuana, but also the vaping issue I talked about a few minutes ago, is that something that is measured called perception of risk goes down. So individuals find that their perception of marijuana as a harmful drug goes down, and it's seen as less harmful than it used to be. That's interesting, especially when we talk about the current strains of marijuana being stronger than they may have been in generations past. And the interesting thing, we do our own surveys here of substance use. And most of the surveys that we run indicate over the last several years increased report of not only marijuana use, but other drug use as well. So this idea that a perception of risk, I think, is something worth looking into. But in terms of specific locations where marijuana is legal, this report, the lessons learned from marijuana legalization in 4 U.S. states and D.C., identifies, for example, in Alaska, school suspensions for marijuana use and possession increased 141% from 2015 to 2017. In Central Oregon, visits to hospital emergency rooms for marijuana poisoning have increased 2,000%. Colorado law enforcement officials report a 50% increase in illegal grow operations in the rural areas of Colorado. And also in Colorado, the 4-year average now for marijuana-related traffic deaths is 66% higher after legalization. So on the one hand, we have the argument that prohibition isn't working, people are using. There may be a better and safer and fairer and more economically viable way of doing this. And by legalizing recreational marijuana, we'll be able to utilize law enforcement resources in other places. We're going to reduce the criminality of marijuana, and hopefully reduce the unfair treatment of African Americans when it comes to marijuana use. And we're going to raise a lot of money that's going to help the schools and the roads and all the municipalities. And it's going to provide for treatment and so on, more research. On the other hand, we have the argument that marijuana, there's still a lot to learn about marijuana, that legalization of marijuana may put adolescents at further risk, that there are significant law enforcement challenges related to legal law enforcement. So the point is that there's a lot of information out there. I would encourage you to find it before you make this decision on Proposal 1. But there's also, some questions that just haven't been answered. One of the issues that first came to mind when I thought about legal recreational marijuana here in the state of Michigan is, what does that mean for the workplace? What does it mean for employers and employees? As an employer, how are we going to handle legal marijuana? How does it differ from alcohol? And of course, there are some physiological factors that are different. So, and I think there are still some unanswered questions there. The fact remains that marijuana is illegal on the federal level. Marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. Those things are going to have to be resolved at some point. There's a conflict between state law and federal law that's just going to have to be resolved at some point, but it's not resolved now. So I was looking into this idea of marijuana in the workplace, and I found a great article, which also happened to be in the Detroit Free Press. First of all, it indicated that positive marijuana tests have been on the rise in the last 5 years. From 2013 to 2017, there was an increase of positive marijuana tests in the workplace from 2.1% to 2.6%. That may not seem like a lot, but I think it speaks to this idea of perception of risk and how the whole conversation and landscape of marijuana is changing. But I want to just read a couple quotes from this really lengthy article. This is by the way, the September 23rd, 2018 Detroit Free Press. If you want to go into the Free Press archives, you might be able to find this article. But the gist of the article is summed up in a quote by Michelle Lee Flores, who is a Los Angeles labor attorney. And I'm just going to read her quote here. The first 4 months of recreational marijuana being legal in Canada, there was a lot of a sense of empowerment from people saying, it's legal, you can't do anything to me. But she goes on to say that it's not a get out of jail free card. And in fact, I'm going to read to you from the legislation, the act itself, not what's on the ballot. The ballot is sort of truncated just to highlight some of the law that will be enacted. But I'm going to read to you directly from the act as it relates to employers and employees. Quote, this act does not require an employer to permit or accommodate conduct otherwise allowed by this act in any workplace or on the employee's property. This act does not prohibit an employer from disciplining an employee for violation of a workplace drug policy or for working while under the influence of marijuana. This act does not prevent an employer from refusing to hire, discharging, disciplining, or otherwise taking an adverse employment action against a person with respect to hire, tenure, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of that person's violation of a workplace drug policy or because that person was working while under the influence of marijuana. So it is, in fact, not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You're not free to do anything that you want, it just because marijuana now may be legal. Also, the article goes on to point out something I mentioned earlier, and that is for employers who have federal contracts or have employees who are licensed through federal agencies. There's no gray area there. The federal government considers marijuana an illegal substance and has a zero tolerance policy. The article mentions specifically Ford Motor Company and Fiat Chrysler, both large employers here in Michigan, and both companies say that a positive test will still disqualify a candidate for employment. So now that's, again, the article called it a gray area, and I think that's a good way to put it. Marijuana, as I think most people know, stays in the system for a length of time. And so how do we determine whether somebody is working under the influence of marijuana? How is this going to impact on workplace policies and procedures? It really is going to be interesting to see how this works in a real world situation once this proposal passes. There's other questions as well, and including driving under the influence. I mentioned that in Colorado the marijuana related traffic deaths have gone up. There's a lot of attention and emphasis being put on roadside testing now, trying to find a reliable and consistent roadside testing protocol similar to, say, an alcohol-related traffic stop. That doesn't seem to exist now, although I know there's a pilot program here in Michigan and in other places, and I know that there's an emphasis on training patrol officers to identify somebody who may be under the influence of marijuana. But while impairment may be impairment, marijuana and alcohol are certainly two different types of substances, and testing for that is necessarily maybe two different kinds of testing. So all of these unanswered questions go back to my idea, my concern for the permanence of this. We may be entering into uncharted territory. I humorously said I was at a farmer's market in Lansing, Michigan, not so long ago. And as I walked around, there were the typical kinds of things you would see in a farmer's market. There was fruit stands and vegetable stands and essential oil stands, and people selling their crafts and so on. And I was jokingly telling the people that I was with that if Proposal 1 passes, this farmer's market is going to look a lot different in 2019 when marijuana is legal and marijuana will be in many different types of consumables. And while I said that in jest, there is some real truth to that. It will really be a different landscape. And I want to just make sure that people have the information to make an educated decision when they go into the voting booth on November 6th. So I hope this was helpful. If you have an opinion, either pro or con, on this information, I would love to hear it. And please stay tuned for further podcasts from us. But as everyone has been saying, go out and vote. November 6th is only about 3 weeks away. Go out and exercise your civic duty. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you down the road. Thanks for listening to this episode of the ADE Spotlight podcast. If you would like to be a guest on one of our podcasts, or if you have an idea for a topic you'd like us to cover, please feel free to drop us a line. We'd love to hear your suggestions. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to check out ADE Solutions, a new website from ADE. There you will find a variety of quizzes and assessments covering a whole range of behavioral health related topics, including substance use, gambling, mental health disorders, eating disorders, and the like. If you have concerns about yourself or a loved one in these areas, please access the website and check out the assessments. Or if you simply want to expand your knowledge on these topics, on the education tab on that website, we have a variety of quizzes as well as other podcasts similar to the one that you just listened to. You can find that at www.ade.solutions, or you can link to it from our corporate website, www.adeincorp.com.